Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, To Pay or Not to Pay, the Rise of Ransomware in 2021. My name is Michael Nelson, and on behalf of everyone at LexisNexis, I want to take this opportunity to thank each and every one of you who have joined this webinar. These events are successful due to your support, so thank you very much for attending. The response has been overwhelming, and this is due to both the topic and our presenter, Dudley Kneller. Dudley, as I'm sure some of you may be aware, is a partner at Gadens, a leading Australian law firm with 97 partners and almost 900 staff across offices in Adelaide, Brisbane, Melbourne, Perth and Sydney. Dudley is a highly experienced lawyer with international and domestic experience, advising on commercial, regulatory and technology matters, with specializations in fintech, cyber risk, privacy and strategic sourcing and supply projects. Dudley has over 20 years experience practicing across Australia, Europe and the UK, and has worked on projects based in a range of countries, including the Philippines, India and across South America. We'll be recording this session today so we can share it with the people who couldn't make it. But on that note, I will pass you over to today's presenter, Mr. Dudley Kneller. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael, and welcome and good morning or good afternoon to all of our attendees for today's session. Thanks for making the time out of your Thursday week as we head into an Easter weekend. As Michael said, we're here today to talk about ransomware, and I have to say I find out of all of the security incidents or security breaches, it's the ransomware attacks that seem to attract the most attention. There's probably a couple of reasons for that. The first and foremost is that unlike other security incidents or security breach events where a hacker may infiltrate an organization, steal or access data and then make a hasty retreat into the night, ransomware attacks are very different. They're very brazen. They involve hackers who are very confident in their abilities to remain anonymous and out of harm's way. They're quite prepared to engage directly with victim organisations to negotiate, to hold those organisations to ransom. So they're very different types of security breach events to your, I guess you'd call them run-of-the-mill security incidents that we read about. So today's topic is, well, I certainly find the topic interesting. I hope you guys do as well, and I'm happy to take questions as we go, but I'm hopeful there'll be some questions towards the end of the session today. So without further ado, let's talk all things ransomware, and a special thanks before I get started to LexisNexis Regulatory Compliance for having me speak today. Ransomware. So 2020 saw seven times as many ransomware campaigns as 2019, and for those of you who like the facts and figures, there was a 139% year-on-year increase in ransomware attacks in Q3 of 2020 last year from Q3 of 2019, the year before. Some people have asked, well, why have we seen this this huge upswing in ransomware attacks? And there's probably lots of answers to that question. One is definitely the COVID-19 outbreak, where we saw, almost 100% of workplaces having to move quickly from their office-based and very secure environments to their home-based work-from-home environments. Certainly a contributing factor, but also what we've also seen in that period is a number of organisations who have been attacked by ransomware who've been prepared to pay the ransom, and that's led to a huge influx of further ransomware campaigns. Traditional advice has always been don't pay the ransom. Law enforcement, cybersecurity experts, our regulators all provide that advice. Don't pay the ransom. Get your IT forensics people involved as quickly as possible. See what you can do to recover the data through traditional means. But better still, be prepared in the first instance and have appropriate data backup services in place to begin with, so that you mitigate and reduce the risk of any data loss occurring if it does in fact happen to your organisation. And certainly that seems to be good advice and the way to go. However, 2020 was very interesting, and we've seen it also to start with in 2021. There's been an increasing number of ransomware attacks where the victim organisation has chosen to pay the ransom. It's not always clear in those cases whether the organisation who's paid actually successfully recovers their data following the payment. The word on the street is that at least 33% or more of ransomware payments don't result in the successful recovery of that information. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail. So with this trend increasing, both in terms of the number of attacks occurring, but also the trend towards making payment, we thought it would be helpful to step through and consider some of the options, some of the pros and cons, whether we should be adopting a new approach to dealing with ransomware requests. Today's agenda, I'm going to cover quite a few areas. First of all, we'll have a look at what we mean when we talk about ransomware. What does a ransomware attack look like? We'll talk about some examples, and there are lots. We'll look at both some Australian examples, but some overseas examples as well. What happens in terms of managing an attack if and when it does occur? Some of the breach notification implications that arise from ransomware attacks. Hopefully we'll tie that off in a neat little bow with some key takeaways for participants today, and hopefully there'll be some time for some questions. So what is a let's look at that one first. So what does a ransomware attack look like? Typically, ransomware is a malicious software, or often referred to as malware, and that malware locks an organisation's data or makes the data on a computer system unusable unless a ransom or a bounty is paid to have the data released or unlocked. Typically, ransomware is delivered by email as an attachment. Sometimes it's embedded within websites that a user may visit. Once the user downloads or opens up that attachment, or that the malware is able to latch on and lock onto the user's system, it activates a data locking mechanism, and that will trigger a ransom demand from the hacker. We'll look at what some of those ransom demands look like in due course. There are lots of different flavors of ransomware, for want of a better word, and that they are becoming more and more sophisticated. Gone are the days of badly worded emails from far off locations promising huge payments if you share your banking details. So the hackers are certainly a lot more sophisticated. In terms of, I guess, some historical context, ransomware's have been around for a long time. It's been around since 1989, when an American AIDS researcher, a guy called Joseph Pop, undertook an attack by distributing 20,000 floppy disks to AIDS researchers in more than 90 countries. He claimed that the disk contained a questionnaire program that assessed the risk of acquiring AIDS. Unfortunately, when the disk also contained malware and was triggered once that computer was powered up 90 times, cutting a long story short, a message was displayed shortly after that, demanding a payment of $189 US and a further payment for software release. So we've seen ransomware occur as of back of 1989. It was fairly uncommon during the 2000s, but what we've seen with the improvements in encryption technology started to become more of a regular feature in terms of cybersecurity incidents, particularly from 2013 onwards. And in 2013, we saw the introduction of a ransomware type called Cryptolocker. That earned its developers not a small sum, but $3 million in US bounties or rewards, and it infected nearly a 250,000 users. If we fast forward that to 2018, we've seen a rapid rise in the incidence and effectiveness of ransomware campaigns. And as I mentioned before, 2020 saw an absolute explosion with a 7-fold increase in attacks occurring. If we look at the next slide, so this is an example of that 2013 Cryptolocker ransomware note. As you can see, if you look at the slide on the page there, it's actually a very helpful and user-friendly message. It talks about what's happened to your computer. It explains that your files have been encrypted. It talks about how you can recover those files, and most importantly, from a ransomware or hacker perspective, it talks about how you go about making payment. So for those of you who don't have a Bitcoin account, and we're probably all kicking ourselves at the moment if we don't, having seen that rise as we have in terms of value over the last little while. But for those of you who don't have a Bitcoin account, it very helpfully provides a help desk number or link for you to contact and arrange how to buy some Bitcoin so you can make your payment. So very user friendly. You will also note on the left hand side of the screen that the request is time critical. So what the hackers are looking to do is to put the organisation, the victim organisation, under a time pressure to respond, to deal with the request quickly. Otherwise, they run the risk of losing their data. This has a benefit from a couple of perspectives as a hacker. One is it encourages prompt payment. Often the amount is not a huge sum, and they work on a volume basis. The other benefit of having a short time period here is that it doesn't give the victim organisation a lot of time to take alternative action to get their forensics team in to explore other options to see whether they can recover that data more quickly. So organisations that are impacted by ransomware attacks are under, in some ways, more pressure than those that suffer a more traditional malware attack, where the time imperative isn't there and isn't as great. If we look at another example, perhaps not as well set out as the Cryptolocker example, but again, very similar themes. Here, there's an explanation as to what's happened in terms of your data being encrypted. It goes about explaining how you make payment in terms of purchasing a key to restore. So again, if you see either of those two pop up on your screen, then you'll know you've been hit by a ransomware attack. I wanted to talk through a few examples, and I will talk a little bit about what we've seen from an overseas perspective, particularly, and those are I guess, some of the more well-known and publicised exampple. I won't talk about all of these examples here. I'm happy to do that offline, but ones that jumped out at me and are worth speaking about. The first is the Carlson Wagonlit travel attack, which occurred in 2020. Carlson Wagonlit are a global travel services company. They ended up, or we think they ended up, paying a $4.5 million ransom to recover their data. The actual attack shut down all of their systems, and whilst the the infection was contained and dealt with fairly quickly, as we understand it. A ransomware request of 400 Bitcoins, which I think at the time was worth about $4.5 million US, was requested and paid for. The interesting thing about the Carlson Wagonlit example is we were actually able to see the negotiations and communications occurring between the hacker and the company online. So it was occurring in live time, and a really good example of in some ways what not to do, but also just in terms of the modus operandi of the hacker themselves and how they went about securing that payment. Garmin's another example also worth talking about, and many of you would be familiar with Garmin. It may typically compete with an Apple or a Fitbit in terms of fitness tracking, but it has other elements to its business as well, and operates in the aviation space. A lot of aviation infrastructure relies on Garmin technology for GPS tracking and mapping requirements. So in 2020, hackers deployed a ransomware tool called Wasted Locker, and that encrypted data on the company's infrastructure. It shut down websites. It prevented customers from obtaining support. Individual users' applications were also impacted. And unlike typical ransomware attacks, didn't actually steal any data and hold it for ransom. It just rendered the applications accessing that data useless until they'd been decrypted. The organisation who deployed the ransomware demanded a fee, and although that it wasn't ever verified by Garmin, we believe that they paid a $10 million ransom to that organisation to release the data and allow their users and customers to get back access to the applications. Blackboard's an interesting example also. Blackboard's a US cloud computing company, typically looking after the healthcare not-for-profit sector. They discovered a ransomware attack in May of last year. They deployed the security team fairly quickly. They were able to deal with the attack very efficiently, and they removed the attackers from their system. The hackers had been able to remove a subset of data from their environment, from Blackboard's environment, before that occurred. Blackboard were took a very interesting approach. They were very upfront about paying the ransom in return for having some promise from the hackers that they would destroy the data that they'd stolen. And Blackboard contacted their users, a number of whom were based in Australia, to say that the attack had occurred and that they'd repelled it, and that they'd made a payment to effectively extract a promise from the hackers that they weren't going to use that data. As you can understand, many affected customers, including those in Australia, were fairly unhappy with that response. The question was asked of Blackboard, and we did at the time on behalf of a client, on what reasonable basis did Blackboard is Blackboard in a position to take any confidence from a hacker promising not to use the data? So we've seen several lawsuits stem from that incident, including a class action in the US as well. What we saw from a Gadens perspective was a number of not-for-profits were impacted in Australia, and what it had a knock-on effect, because some of the data was arguably personal information, and it triggered notification obligations to the Office of the Australian Information Commission. So it caused huge amounts of angst and anxiety amongst customers here, and obviously their customers and users as well, and has typically led to a lot of not-for-profits looking to move off that particular platform. I won't go into the Canon or the Spotless example, but there's been some other examples as well in the US, including Jack Daniels in more recent times. So in terms of managing an attack, as I said at the start, the traditional advice has always been don't pay the ransom. So what are the risks of paying? And I'll look at these in turn. First of all, any sort of payment doesn't guarantee that you'll recover your data. Secondly, if you do make the payment and you do recover your data, there's no guarantee that that data won't be inaccessible or unable to be used as it was previously. So you take that risk when you make the payment that you can take no confidence that you'll actually be able to recover the data that you need. Secondly, by making the payment, what you do is endorse and effectively give a very big tick to the actions of the hacker. What it does is it reinforces that the ransomware business model is effective and is an activity that is worth investing in and worth pursuing with other victims. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly for individual organisations, it makes you a poster child of an organisation who's prepared to pay a ransom. So you'll become very popular overnight within the hacking community and will be subsequently targeted. We found this with a particular example last year. We were able, or we came in late to the piece in relation to this particular case. That the organisation was very pleased that it had been able to restore its data, having not made much of a payment, if at all. But we quickly explained to them that by going down that path, they now really needed to up their security environment, because they would have attracted the attention of the hacking community moving forward as an example of a successful hack in that particular industry. Whilst they had a quick win in terms of managing the breach event itself, the longer term investment required now for that organisation is significant. The final reason or risk in relation to paying is that you do take a risk from a legal perspective in terms of violating anti-money laundering or anti-terrorism laws, where you make a payment to a criminal organisation. Obviously, you do that in good faith. You do that as a way of recovering your data, but it's something to take into account if you do choose to go down that path. I guess one of the questions that people do ask is, well, Dudley, you've talked about all the risks of paying, but why are some organisations choosing to pay the ransom? You know, leaving aside all the risks that you've identified, why do organisations still choose to do that? And the short answer is it's commercial expediency. Sometimes an organisation will be able to secure cyber cover that may cover the cost of the ransomware demand, and I'll talk about insurance, cyber insurance on that point shortly. But for many organisations, including the ones that we saw above, very many or a large number of organisations just see the cost of managing a ransomware attack and the subsequent demand as a cost of doing business, and they place a value on getting access to their data and not being without that access. It's just not an option for them, so they choose to make the payment on a pure commercial expediency basis. You can see I've written an odd phrase there in bullet 4, running a 2-horse race. What do I mean by that? Often an organisation will run a ransomware payment negotiation in parallel with the more standard recovery process, and we'll see which of those two options is the lesser of two evils. So often it becomes a race to the finish, as hackers will usually set a time period for making payment, as you saw above with the example we saw before. And if a payment's not made within that time frame, often the information will be destroyed or will be released publicly. So in the background, the organisation is working hard from a forensics perspective to see whether it can recover the data without having to make that payment. So hence the phrase running a two-horse race. And that's often the approach that certainly that we've taken with incidents that have occurred over the course of last year, some with more success than others. In terms of what we can do to reduce the risk of an attack, I think, and again, I'm no technology expert here, but investing significant and appropriate sums into managing security within your organisation, doing that security hygiene is critical. So having regular backups of your data, taking full regular system backups of servers, databases, where you store your files, ensuring the validity of those backups, having off-site recovery options in place. So if your primary site is hit, you have a backup that you can rely upon. Again, all the usual security hygiene should be applied in the first place to reduce the risk of malware infiltrating your systems to begin with, whether that's through ransomware or whether it's through other malware or other security cybersecurity attacks. From a Gadens perspective, and that there are several schools of thought here in relation to dealing with a ransomware attack. The AFP and I would say a majority of the insurance community are very keen to ensure that organisations don't deal directly with the hacker, that they don't take it upon themselves to negotiate with the hacker. I guess for most incidents that occurred last year, took that advice. With several of them, though, our ability to negotiate with the hacker bought the client organisation more time. And we were able to do that with a hacker based in the UK that was threatening to release information of a client. If our client didn't pay a particular bounty, we were able to keep them, I guess, on the line or interested in continuing the negotiation whilst our client worked quickly in the background to get itself to a point where it was happy to make a public disclosure in relation to the incident that had occurred. So I think there's not necessarily a black and white or right and wrong answer in relation to dealing with or not dealing with a hacker. In certain circumstances, it may be justified to negotiate with the hacker directly if it buys your organisation more time, but certainly it's something that you need to consider carefully and have relevant experts involved. With other experiences around ransomware, we're often seeing clients who are not necessarily directly impacted as being the victim organisation, but it's those clients and organisations down the chain. So it's the customers or the suppliers of an impacted organisation that are affected. Often they hear about the incident after the ransom has been paid or after the event has been remedied. So they're often late to the piece. To the extent that their data is involved, particularly personal information, it triggers obligations around breach notification. So I'll talk a little bit about that shortly, but to the extent that information is personal information, it may trigger requirements to notify the Information Commissioner of the breach event occurring. Often it will lead to contract breach claims and more often still, because of the security issue now with that particular organisation, often its customers and suppliers will look to conduct vendor assessment and decide whether that's an organisation they want to deal with moving forward. So a lot of the activities that we were involved in are actually offboarding that particular arrangement and looking for a new provider. In terms of other, I guess, softer hygiene outside of the technical and technology infrastructure, organisations that spend time and effort on developing appropriate policies, be they incident response plans, disaster recovery plans, business continuity planning, are better placed to manage breach events when they do occur. So again, if you're an organisation and serious about managing cybersecurity risk, in particular ransomware attacks, you will spend the time raising awareness within your organisation. You'll be running phishing expeditions, as they're called, with staff and contractors. You'll have policies and procedures for staff to follow and contractors on your site. You'll have incident response plans and actually test those incident response plans to ensure that they trigger appropriately if an event does occur. I did say a little bit about breach notification before. And again, I don't want to bore the socks off you by walking through all of the requirements under the Privacy Act. Very briefly, the Privacy Act was amended to include a bolster to APP 11, the security principle, in 2018. We've seen huge numbers of notifications made since then, and the OAIC puts out a very helpful quarterly report identifying particular sectors that are impacted and talking about the numbers and also very helpfully talking about best practice in terms of breach notification and breach preparedness. In Australia, there's I guess a loose time period of about 30 days from when the breach occurs for you to determine whether it's an eligible breach under the Act. Justifying termination, there are some thresholds to meet, including the serious harm threshold, and I'm happy to speak to that outside of this presentation. For those of you who are in the regulated space, particularly if you're in the financial services space and are regulated by APRA, you may be subject to CPS 234. That imposes a stricter requirement around notification. So you have 72 hours to notify. And what we've found with some breach events occurring last year is that organisations with a footprint outside of Australia are often in a very challenging and difficult position and need to be aware of breach obligations that may apply outside Australia. For instance, the New Zealand Privacy Act has been updated as of December last year, and we had a breach event occurring around that time over Christmas, and had to notify the New Zealand Privacy Commissioner of that breach event as well. Some of you may have a footprint further afield in the EU or UK or even in the US. Some of you would be familiar with the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, and that imposes a strict 72-hour notification obligation. From an Australian company perspective, breach notifications can be particularly challenging for those that do have a footprint outside of Australia. We saw in 2018, I think it was, with the PageUp breach that that organisation was caught between a rock and a hard place in relation to the notification obligation, and it chose to notify early so it could meet its 72-hour obligation in the EU and UK. And it probably wasn't at a point where it was had explored the breach enough to make a sensible and helpful notification. What it did do well, and it was commented on at the time, was it followed up those initial notifications with further information as and when it came to hand. So a really good example of an organisation that had been impacted, but really managed the comms piece well, and also the compliance piece. So I might just see if we've got any questions, and we do have one from Utam. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Utam's question, what is the average time frame that an attacker gives to the target organisation? Look, there isn't an average that I could necessarily point to. It typically is it measured in hours or days, and certainly not weeks. So again, as we talked about in the early part of the conversation, any ransomware demand is wanting to encourage quick and prompt payment. So attackers will typically give an organisation a very short period of time, measured in 24 or 48 hours at the very most, typically. Hopefully that's answered that question for you, Mutum. In terms of, well, perhaps just before we move on, actually, the slide that we've got there up on screen, whilst it doesn't go into the detail, it's a really useful slide from a breach notification perspective. So if a ransomware attack occurs and personal information is involved, it's a really useful slide to work through in terms of, do we need to notify? Establishing whether an eligible breach has occurred, whether the thresholds for serious harm have been met. If you're able to deal with the breach event very quickly, that it may be that you can remedy before any serious harm occurs. So there may be an exception that's available to you that will avoid you having to make that notification. I think it's important to understand that some organisations do fly the gauntlet and choose not to notify when they perhaps should be notifying, and certainly there are some penalties for that, which they should be aware of. There's a long and in some ways very helpful discussion on the OAIC website about how to go about notifying. There is a portal that the OAIC provides. We tend not to use that, and to tailor any communications directly to individuals that are affected, and also to the Commissioner, so that we can shape the content of that. But again, for smaller organisations, the portal does provide a very useful option if a breach event does occur. I will move on to some of the key takeaways, and hopefully there'll be some opportunity for questions as well. So I guess in some ways, recapping, ransomware attacks are increasing. We've seen that through COVID-19 with people working from home, and also there was a huge number of ransomware attacks associated with COVID-19 directly. People were very keen to receive information about the virus, and were very prepared to click on suspicious links. And so we saw a lot of malware released last year because of that. The incidence of organisations paying the ransom, whilst I think it's still increasing, I don't think there's anything to suggest that that we've seen, certainly, that would change the advice of law enforcement or the cybersecurity experts amongst us, to say that where you can resist that temptation to pay, focus on best practice to begin with. And if you are hit by a ransomware attack or even a malware attack, if you've done some of that hygiene work beforehand, you'll reduce the exposure to the organisation. And if you've got yourself an incident response plan where you've got access to good forensics, you can hopefully mitigate the loss or damage to that data quickly in the event that an event does occur to you. Speaking of which, I've banged on a little bit about the importance of incident response plans, and if that's the one thing that you take away from this this presentation, is to make sure that you develop, review and test your incident response plans. Building awareness within the organisation is critical. The critical link or weak link for many organisations is their staff, and that's where we see most of the malware and ransomware attacks coming through. They're coming through on email and and suspicious websites. Taking data security and privacy seriously, having that allocated to someone at board level and taking a top-down approach is important. It's not an IT problem. It's an all of business risk. It needs to be seen in that way. I haven't talked much about insurance at all. Very briefly, the cyber insurance market in Australia is still relatively new. It's been around for a long time in the US because they've had mandatory data breach laws in place for some time, relatively new in Australia. There are lots of policies out there. Some of them are better than others. The adage, the big print giveth and the small print taketh away, probably couldn't be truer for cybersecurity insurance policies. So being very careful that you understand what you're covered for and what you're not covered for in a cybersecurity policy is really important. Ensuring that triggers at the appropriate time as well, and that you're not in the situation of one of our clients last year having to wait for sign-off from London underwriters whilst the breach was occurring, and being unable to do a whole lot about that at the time. So being very careful to make sure that the broker that you deal with understands cyber and can assist you with that appropriately.
Dudley, I think we've just got another question from Adam Just.
Sure, let's have a look. So I'll read that one out. Thanks for your question, Adam. Adam's question, has there been evidence or instances of data being used for other nefarious purposes, sold on dark web, or are most cases simply pay now or we'll delete everything? Look, there's a myriad number of different examples outside the traditional we'll hold on to your data and if you don't pay, we'll delete everything approach. Some organisations, hacking organisations, do it for fun. We had an example way back in 2011, 2012, where a disgruntled Queensland truck driver, I think he was at the time, wasn't successful in a role that he'd applied for with an organisation and took it upon himself to do everything within his power to destroy that organisation through the use of malware, which he successfully did. So Distribute IT was effectively destroyed as a Melbourne-based business based on the activities of this individual. The other examples which are worth mentioning are that depending on the nature of the data and the information that's being accessed, it can be extremely valuable. On the dark web, there is certain values given to credit card information with CVV, credit card information with CVV plus name, that they all have a value that attaches to them. So, Adam, to your question, which I think is a very good one, that there are lots of instances of data being used for other purposes, and very much any identifying data that can be used by a hacker to perpetrate a fraud on an individual, identity theft or similar, is valuable, and there is an active and growing market on the dark web for that.
And while I was going to say on that note, we've just had another question from Michelle Greenfield asking whether people target a particular sector more than others, like financial services companies. Would it be too naive to assume that a small non-profit organisation would be low risk in terms of being a target?
Well, I guess, and I'll attack that question in two ways. The first is, yes, certain industries are pose very rich targets for the hackers. So industries that deal in health-related information or financial information are particularly attractive for obvious reasons, because that information can be sold at a higher value on the dark web. I think it's probably naive or perhaps optimistic to think that just because you're not necessarily in a high risk sector that some way you'll go under the radar. We've seen lots of not-for-profits the subject of attacks last year. And as I mentioned, a lot of organisations, be they non-profit, education, or in perhaps what you regard as lower risk sectors, are still impacted because they have suppliers or customers that are in the technology space that they need to work with, or they have arrangements in place with, and so they're impacted from a downstream perspective. So so I wouldn't say that you're in a safer position because you're in perhaps perceived to be in a lower risk industry, or dealing in data that's not as attractive as health data or financial services data. And hopefully that's answered that question.
Thanks. And look, speaking in one of my capacities as a trainer at LexisNexis, if organizations, and obviously LN is as likely to be attacked with malware as anyone else, if we were to increase our internal training, what kind of training should be run that might lead to a reduced vulnerability to ransomware attacks?
Yep. So no, it's a good question, Michael. And I mentioned the importance of raising awareness as part of the toolkit that you have in place to mitigate and reduce risk around this issue. And your staff within an organisation are the frontline staff. So they're your link between your organisation and the outside world. And as I mentioned right at the start, ransomware and malware often enters an organisation through its frontline staff. So it comes into organisations as innocuous looking emails with dodgy links and attachments. So running what I call phishing expeditions or cybersecurity awareness sessions with your frontline staff is a really good way of raising awareness, providing examples of what phishing emails look like. Some organisations will run phishing expeditions unbeknownst to staff. They'll send over a period of several weeks. They'll send in test emails to see whether people click on the attachments, and that will highlight where an organisation is in terms of its awareness. It will have some follow-up for those individuals to say, why did you feel that you needed to click on the link, stepping through what to look out for in terms of emails that come through that you're not expecting. There's a funny example actually of a phishing expedition that was run by a supplier to an organisation, and that they weren't sure what to do in the end because the CEO of the organisation kept clicking on the links as they came through. So even with the best of intentions, it's it's CEOs and CFOs who are often at fault in these sorts of examples too. It's not just frontline staff, but yeah, a good question.
Thanks, Dudley. I think we've got one more question that's just filled it in from Peter Brass.
Yep.
Who's basically said, it's important for training and awareness to be part of staff induction.
Yeah, absolutely. And just maybe to add to that point, Peter, which I think is a very good one, is that the process and procedure for different organisations will vary. So what you may do within one organisation might be quite different in the next organisation that you join. So incorporating training and awareness as part of your onboarding and staff induction is really important. Yeah, so good point there from Peter. Thank you. Now I'm conscious of time. I'll just jump to the next slide there. And for those of you who are keen and wanting to find out a little bit more about the topic, there's some links there, and hopefully that will be made available and certainly will be part of the recording for you to go and do some further follow-up. In terms of standout links, for individuals, the Stay Smart Online is a very useful link. The ACSC, or the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, provides again, some good information around ransomware and broader cybersecurity issues. The ASD, or Australian Securities Directorate, provides some strategies around mitigating cyber incidents, and is also worth a look. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner also provides a very useful resource for privacy, obviously, but also in relation to security activities that you can take as an organisation to manage privacy and security more effectively. I think that's pretty much it for me today. So a little bit more time left for questions. So perhaps give people the opportunity to send through a few questions. Otherwise, we'll give you guys an early minute for lunch, and appreciate you attending today's session. Hopefully you found it useful. And I think, yeah, we've got one question that's come up. Thanks, Alex. Alex's question: what should I be including in my incident response plan? And I banged on about the importance of incident response planning in the presentation. First and foremost, have an incident response plan. Go about developing one that is easy to follow, that's easily triggered in the event of a breach event occurring, that lists out current contacts within the organisation, but also lists out contacts outside the organisation, whether they're forensics, legal, comms, those providers that you use as an organisation to help with managing these incidents, and regularly updating that incident response plan so that it remains current. Make sure you have a copy that's in paper as well. People often forget to print out a copy, and then if their system goes down, they can't actually access their incident response plan, which is fairly unhelpful. And go about testing it, whether that's testing it once every 12 months or so. It's a good way of making sure that it remains current and it's relevant to your organisation as it changes. So good question, Alex.
All right, well, look, unless there are any more questions, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us at today's webinar, and particularly I'd like to thank Dudley Kneller for being able to spare the time to share these incredibly valuable insights with us.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thanks everyone for coming along today. Hopefully it's been a good session for you and has raised a few issues and questions for you to take back to your organisation.
Terrific. All right, all the very best for Easter, everyone. Look forward to seeing you at another LexisNexis Dudley Kneller co-presentation very soon.